By way of introduction, I want you to think about the most dysfunctional family that you can think of in America today from the tabloids, or the news, the Hollywood TV shows and whatnot. There are some really messed up families out there, all right? Don't want you to name any of them, but I want you to think about all of their troubles and all the craziness that they get into. Would it surprise you to learn that Joseph's childhood was just as messed up? That he had as many crazy things going on in it? The mystery is how Joseph turns out to be a godly man at all after such turmoil. And that is certainly a question worth exploring, and we're going to do that in the next couple of weeks. But to begin, let's talk about Joseph's upbringing. Let's talk about the dysfunctional household of Jacob. First off, his father. His father had stolen the birthright from his uncle Esau back when they were much younger and caused a rift in the family that took decades to heal. So that's where they started. After that, his father had been duped into marrying the wrong daughter of Laban by Joseph's grandfather. Jacob then decided to make that situation worse by marrying the other daughter too, the one that he loved. The resulting rivalry between these two sisters caused jealousy and division, and ended up with both women pushing their servants onto Jacob to father still more sons in their attempt to monopolize his affections. In the end, Joseph is going to have 11 brothers, the youngest of which is Benjamin, another favorite of Jacob because it was Rachel's other child. He's going to have Reuben, the oldest son, and Simeon and Levi and Judah and Issachar and Zebulun, all born of their mother Leah. And Dan and Naphtali, born of Rachel's servant. And Gad and Asher, born of Leah's servant. Is there any wonder that such a group of brothers would be divided by rivalries and favoritism with 4 different mothers? It would be a miracle if they all got along. So that's the background. But also there's a few other things. You see, Joseph's sister, Dinah, was raped. His older brothers took it upon themselves. His older brothers, Simeon and Levi, went on a revenge spree. They killed the man responsible. They killed that man's father. And then they ended up killing the rest of the men in the town. And if that was not enough, it is also clear that Jacob's household was full of idols to false and foreign gods. For years, they were part of the household, until one day he finally made them bury them all. So it is clear that although Jacob knew God and had known God for some time, for much of his life he didn't live like someone who followed God. And if you looked at his family, you'd think the same thing. These are not people that follow God. So what kind of religious upbringing did Joseph have? His mother had been a worshiper of other gods until just recently. His father had just recently rediscovered the Lord and begun to worship properly. We don't know what his upbringing was like, but that's the background of it. Could we expect Joseph to turn out as anything other than a conflicted and misguided young man? I wonder how would you or I fare with such an upbringing? If not for the grace of God, what might we have turned out to be? But you might be sitting there this morning thinking back on your childhood and saying, you know what, it wasn't much better. My dad was this, my mom was that, it was crazy in our house. Maybe you saw things that you'd rather forget. Maybe you've heard things that you wish you'd never heard. If that is indeed the case, let me comfort you this morning by saying that God certainly knows about your sorrows because he's dealt with them before. Let's look at the first 4 verses of chapter 37. It says, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. We set the scene with the youngest brothers out tending the flocks. So we have Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher and Joseph. Well, Joseph's oldest brothers are now grown men. If Joseph is 17, these older brothers are in their 20s. They're men. They're beginning their own lives, but they're still living in close proximity and still working for and still working with their father. Joseph brings a bad report to Jacob. Now, if you're not the youngest sibling, you can imagine such a scenario, because it's not as if a younger sibling has ever done this before, have they? Gone to mom and dad and tattled on you? I'm not the youngest, you can see that. It happens, so we are not shocked that the youngest ran and told on them. Even at 17, Joseph does this. I wonder what were they doing? Were they being lazy and not doing their jobs? Were they being careless with the flocks? Who knows? But clearly the older brothers find out about it. They find out that Joseph has been speaking to their father about them, and they are not happy. In addition to that, Jacob's favoritism towards Joseph is evident to all. Jacob loved Joseph's mother, Rachel. He had wanted her to be happy, and for years she had been unable to have children. She had been very upset about that. So when Joseph was born to her, Jacob loved him very much and favored him. To make matters worse, Jacob rubs that favoritism in his other sons' faces by buying Joseph an expensive present and giving it just to him. I wonder, did Jacob know what he was doing, what he was creating when he was like this? Either he was blind to the fact that his gift was going to cause trouble, or he just didn't care. His favoritism was that overpowering. Inevitably, we have jealousy, and that jealousy turns to hatred. It would have been hard for children raised in a stable and loving home to not react badly to seeing a younger sibling favored so blatantly. Every one of us has seen Everybody Loves Raymond at some point. We understand when the younger sibling is favored, how difficult that can be. So it is no surprise that these boys, raised amidst plenty of bad examples on their father's part, on their other brother's part, and several of them already have blood on their hands. They have already killed. It is no wonder that their jealousy becomes hatred. Joseph's brothers here face a pivotal moment, and they fail at that. They could have put a stop to their jealousy of Joseph. They could have stopped it before it grew in their hearts and became hatred, but they did not. We've been there too. We've all had a chance to stop a sinful thought at its beginning. When you first have that thought, that inclination, that idea, we've had the chance to stop that before it matures and becomes an action. You see, to feel slighted by Jacob was not a sin. It was not sinful for these boys to feel bad about being treated unfairly. That's only natural. But to nurture that emotion until it becomes hatred, to let it grow and continue, was a choice that led them down a path towards greater sin, which we will learn about shortly. Verses 5 to 11. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. You see, we have trouble. We have jealousy on the part of the brothers. And what does Joseph do? He makes it worse. In addition to his father's favoritism, in addition to his tattling on them, in addition to the expensive gift, now Joseph pushes his brothers one more time, and he tells them about his dreams. Hard to think that Joseph was naive enough not to see that his dream about ruling over his brothers was going to make them upset. Makes me wonder if there was a lack of maturity here. He was 17 years old. How many of us, when we were 16, 17, had the ability to keep our mouths shut when we had good news that might have upset our siblings? Think back to your teenage years. Could you have kept good news to yourself if you knew it would have made your siblings upset? Or would that have been your intent all along? Chance to let them see how good you're doing. It's no surprise that they hated him all the more after that first dream. So what does Joseph do? He makes matters a lot worse. He doesn't just tell them about the one dream. He tells them about two dreams. And Jacob, their father, doesn't react too well to being told by his favorite son that he will one day bow down before him. Now he knows that he's treated Joseph with special favor. He knows that Joseph is his favorite. And he's probably thinking, is this arrogance what I get in return? I treat this kid better than any of the other ones, and now he's telling me that he's going to rule over me? I can imagine that he didn't take that so well. And now we see what happens, beginning in verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They've moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So it begins as a simple errand. This is probably something that's happened many times before, something Jacob thought not about a second time. So hey, my sons are off grazing the flocks. Let me send Joseph to check on them. Evidently, Jacob didn't understand how upset his sons were with Joseph. Last time he sent them to check on them, he brought a bad report back, and they were not happy about it. Well, Joseph does the right thing, right? He obeys his father. This should be something. He should be out one day, see how his brother's doing, and come back. Little do we know what the brothers are thinking in the meantime, verses 18 to 20. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. You see, out of our hearts are where our actions come from. And in their hearts, Joseph's brothers had been harboring jealousy and nurturing hatred. Is it any wonder that when a perfect opportunity presented itself, they sprang into action? You see, when we allow sin to grow and mature, it always leads to death. Now, in the case of Joseph's brothers, it was heading there literally towards death. The death of Joseph and their plans. And they say to themselves, here comes that dreamer. That lets us know that it was pride that pushed them over the edge. It was pride that was wounded when he said, I will rule over you in my dream. That he had dared to predict that they would bow to him was too much for them. Not only did they plan to kill Joseph in cold blood, his brothers also decided to think the whole thing through. They thought about where they would hide his body to get rid of the evidence. They thought about what lie they would tell their father after the fact. That's the sort of thing that happens when you contemplate something for a while. It seems to me that some of his brothers have been mulling over the idea of killing him for some time, thinking about what they might possibly do. Most of us on the spur of the moment, I'm hoping, can't come up with a plan to murder someone, hide the body, and come up with a lie afterwards. If you can, please let me know, and I'll avoid hanging out with you one-on-one. That seems like something that would take some time. You see, there was time. They discussed it. There was a moment here when any one of them could have said, this is crazy. We're not going to murder him. But instead, they all and they are all plotting that, except perhaps Reuben. And here we have an interesting case, and I put a question mark because it's interesting. Is he the hero or not? Let's see what he does in our passage today. It says, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. You see, out of 10 brothers, mine's Benjamin, who's not with them. He's got maybe one who is a good man. And this one man is all there is. 9 brothers have agreed to be a part of killing Joseph. Only one has second thoughts. As the oldest, Reuben stood to lose the most. Do you ever think about that? He stood to lose the most from Jacob favoring Joseph. Because Reuben is supposed to be the one that inherits the largest share of their father's property. Their father, if they remember and know this well, had stolen the birthright from their uncle Esau. So they know that this kind of thing can happen. It wouldn't be hard for Reuben to think that Joseph is going to steal my inheritance from me. Joseph doesn't even have to try, because Jacob loves him more than me. And yet it is Reuben who stands up for him. Reuben is walking a thin line here. He is trying to find a way to let his brothers vent their anger and put a scare into Joseph, and yet leave a window so that he can later go back and save him. Makes me wonder what his motives were. Was it out of genuine concern for his brother? Maybe. Was it out of hopes that Jacob would reward Reuben for saving him? He saves Joseph and all of a sudden Reuben is a favorite too. Maybe he was thinking that. Or maybe, as the oldest brother, he just had a little bit of that sense of duty. He's my brother, I'm the oldest. What will our father say? I'm supposed to look out for him. Whatever it was, Reuben thought that through and said, you know what, I'm not going to oppose all 9 of them because they'll probably just beat me up. I'm going to do something else. Instead, I'll deflect their rage and come back and rescue him later. I wonder, could any of us done any better? Facing all of your siblings, if you had so many, all intent on a plan, could you have done any better than Reuben? Probably not. Verses 23 and 24. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. So Joseph is thrown into an empty cistern, and if you've never heard the word cistern before, don't worry about it. It's pretty old. Essentially, it's a hole in the ground. It is a hole in the ground that you stored water in the desert. They would leave these from place to place so that when you were traveling in the desert, you could actually find water for yourself and for your flocks. This particular one was empty, but there's no hope of escape for Joseph in it. It's basically a hole in the ground with a cover on the top. The only way he's getting out of there is if someone lowers a rope to him. There's no climbing out of this cistern. But not before they strip off that richly ornamented robe from him. His symbol of favoritism, the thing that they hated the most, they rip that off of him before throwing him in. You see, they may have taken the robe from him, but they know they can't keep it. That's a situation that the letter of St. James echoes. It says, you want something but don't get it. You kill and covet, but you can't have what you want. Chapter 4, verse 2. You say, what did they want so badly? What did these brothers really want? In the end, it boils down to this. They wanted Jacob's favor. They wanted the love of their father. Is there any conceivable way that killing Joseph is going to get them that? Think about that. Is killing one brother going to make their father love them more with him out of the picture? Of course it isn't. But that's what sin does. It twists us up and it claims to give us things that we ought to know that it will not. But we believe it because that's what we want. And sin has a way of doing that. Verses 25 through 28. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. And so we have an idea that comes to them over lunch. You see, having murder in your heart evidently doesn't blunt your appetite. No sense in allowing lunch to go to waste just because Joseph is sitting in the cistern awaiting his fate. We might as well have lunch. And who should come by with a caravan, it's on the same one, of Ishmaelites. And I think this proves that God has a sense of irony. Because who are the Ishmaelites? The Ishmaelites are descended from Abraham's first son, Ishmael. That would have been Joseph's great uncle. Joseph's grandfather, Isaac, was the favored son, and his great-grandmother, Sarah, drove Ishmael away and said, "Get this boy out of here because I don't want him sharing my son's inheritance." Sound familiar? Old problems don't go away. So now, here are these Ishmaelites. They're some degree of cousin of Joseph. They ride by as Joseph's own brothers are trying to find out how to get rid of him. It's only been a couple generations, and now the story is repeating itself. They haven't learned a thing. So Judah speaks up and says, "You know what? What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood?" You see, there's no profit in simply murdering him. Why not sell him into slavery and at least get some cash out of it? He'd be as good as dead, wouldn't he? Who could ever expect to see someone again that you've sold into slavery? If you know the story, you know that that's not the way it turns out in the end. But Judah's got an idea here. It makes me wonder, is this Judah's conscience or his wallet talking? He says, after all, he's our brother. But so isn't it nice when you can salve your conscience a little bit and make money at the same time? It's a win-win situation for Judah. No more annoying Joseph to bother them, plus 2 pieces of silver each. It sounds as if Judah has hit upon the perfect plan. Verses 29 and 30. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Evidently, Reuben had been gone during that discussion. He went away thinking when his brothers left, he could come back. That was his plan. So he sneaks back to the cistern, takes the lid off, and he's not there. He thought his brothers would leave Joseph in there to die of thirst. And then they could say, "Hey, we didn't lay a hand on him. We didn't kill him. We threw him in a cistern and left him die, but we didn't kill him." He would be the hero. He would save the day. But it seems as if the people that you plot murder with can't be trusted. Amazing, huh? You plot a murder with someone and you think you can trust them, and you can't. So Reuben reacts in grief, interestingly enough. He reacts in grief. Perhaps he's the only one who realized how big a mistake this whole thing was. In his frustration, he reveals to his brothers that he had planned to double-cross them. He goes back to them and says, "Where is Joseph? Why else would he have returned to the cistern and be asking about him?" Did you ever contemplate that? Reuben just gave up the whole plan. Now his other brothers know that he was going to double-cross them. We don't know if anything came of that, but he just made himself an interesting mistake. Verses 31 and 34. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it and see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. It makes you wonder, can sin be so easily concealed? You see, we may be able to hide the evidence, as they got rid of Joseph and faked this evidence with his robe. But the guilt stain on their hearts could not be so easily hidden. The lie may have convinced Jacob, and it did, that Joseph had been torn apart by a wild animal. But ask yourself, is this indeed the perfect crime? How could this possibly come back to bite these guys later? And here we have in verses 34 and 36. I already read 34, but I'll read it again. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to him. Came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son. So his father wept for him. You see, what they wanted from their father, they are not going to get. These brothers may have hoped that Jacob's love for Joseph would now trickle back to them. Now that Joseph is gone, he will love us, right? But they were fooling themselves. Jacob pours that love into grief instead. He refuses to be consoled by his other sons. Come on, Jacob, you've got 11 other sons. Don't despair. But he won't. For many, many days, he mourns the loss of Joseph. And we know from later on in the story that eventually Jacob is going to take all of that love that was for Joseph and give it to Benjamin. And thus these boys are cheated of their hopes. They may have conspired to get rid of one brother that had their father's favoritism, only to succeed in transferring it to another. They have not earned it for themselves. Thus sin always cheats us out of what we think it will give us. And lastly, verse 36, we learn the fate of Joseph. It says, meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Joseph is sold into slavery. He's taken down to Egypt. Let us think for a moment on Joseph's life thus far. What have we learned about him so far? We learn that he came from a dysfunctional family with a troubled father, a meddling mother, and brothers that you would be generous to call not so nice. We have learned that he was one moment the favored child, the top of the heap, and the next sold into slavery. What sort of person would you or I be in that situation, having gone through that? Would we be despairing? Nobody loves me, woe is me. Would we be bitter? I didn't do anything to deserve it, it's not my fault. Or would we be plotting our revenge? Oh, I'm going to get those brothers. I'm going to kill them all. Who would we be? Would you or I be ready to withstand a time of trial and testing? This was not Joseph's trial and testing. It is coming up shortly, and we will look at it next week. For Joseph, that time of trial is fast approaching.